Good afternoon and good morning again, and welcome to the first 100 Days Town Hall discussion presented by Color Magazine and in partnership with White Men as Full Diversity Partners, WMFDP. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to join us. Today, we focus on the Biden administration's task and this country's need to focus on systemic racism and what steps leaders and D&I professionals and we ourselves personally have to take to steer us towards greater inclusion and equity. This conversation is beyond political affiliation. And in order to cool the social tensions and close the racial divide that plagues our country, we have to focus on actionable steps that will create sustainable change. I'm excited to have our esteemed panel of D&I leaders who will explore how we can reach a place where inclusion and equity is possible. Before we get to our experts, though, I'd like to introduce Gwendolyn Van Duzleri, WMFDP's Business Development and Marketing Manager, to share some words about her organization and what they would like to bring to this conversation. Gwendolyn.
Thank you for your words, Camilla. We're very honored to be in partnership with you and with Evan and the team at Color Magazine. So thank you for this webinar today. Thank you, all of you, for joining us for this important conversation on the direction of diversity, equity, and inclusion in an ever-changing landscape. I'll quickly introduce myself and our company, and then I'll move to why this conversation is so important today. My name is Gwendolyn Van Duzleri, and I oversee our marketing and communications efforts at WMFDP, FDP Global. As Camilla said, WMFDP stands for White Men as Full Diversity Partners. Our name is our mission. For 25 years, we've been helping insider leaders understand their impact and value in creating inclusive organizations. Our customized leadership development programs bring transformative change at the individual and organizational levels by challenging mindsets and assumptions, and by building new behaviors and skills to partner effectively and meaningfully across difference. You can check us out, WMFDP.com. I'll put it in the chat. So in this last year alone, diversity and inclusion programs have gone from near extinction to being heralded as a must-do for all organizations. We've braved a pandemic, social unrest, and political whiplash. We've gone from the Trump administration's executive order banning divisive or so-called divisive diversity training to only 4 months later, Biden's executive order rescinding Trump's order and rooting out systemic racism. For those of us trying to lead inclusivity in our organizations, it's been a roller coaster. And we also find ourselves confronting greater divisiveness and outright resistance to DEI programs within our organizations. What can we do? How do we pivot? And how do we anticipate this type of turbulence, as Evan and Camilla have said? So with that, and on behalf of WMFDP, I would like to thank you, the participants, for joining us today. I'd like to thank Color Magazine for the amazing partnership, and I would like to thank our moderator, panelists, and my colleagues for leading us in a spirited and important conversation. Back to you, Evan.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn. It is a pleasure to be working with you and to be having this very urgent conversation with you all. With that said, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel moderator, Carole Copeland Thomas. I'll keep my remarks brief so we can dive into today's conversation. Carole Copeland Thomas is a TEDx keynote speaker, global thought leader, and the president, CEO, and founder of C. Thomas and Associates. She has an extensive career as a D&I trailblazer, and we are so thrilled to have her guiding today's conversation. With that, the floor is yours, Carole.
Evans, thank you so much. Thank you, Camilla and Gwendolyn, and all of those who are a part of this esteemed panel, and for the audience that is here also. I want to keep this real. I want this to be a real conversation with informative information, and definitely want to keep the audience involved. So as I am going to very briefly highlight the various panel members who you'll hear from shortly, in the chat room, on a scale of 1 to 10, please tell us what your thoughts are in terms of the first 100 days. Now, as Gwendolyn has said, this is not going to be a political conversation. If you are in that direction, then you're going to miss a lot of what we're going to say. But clearly, since we've moved from one administration to the next, there are significant changes, policies, and procedures that are going to be altered, and we want to focus on them. As as I belong to an organization that says we really focus on the issues, not necessarily the elected officials. We're going to be issues driven today. So I see some answers here. Want to keep them going on a scale from 1 to 10. Let us know where we are, where this administration, this White House Biden administration is in terms of their first 100 days. Keep them coming. If you have some comments, we'll refer to them, and we're definitely going to have a spirited conversation and a Q&A session. We have 4 amazing speakers who will bring their reflections to you in 8-minute segments. Then we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to you in the audience. And I know that you're from everywhere. So after you put your number in from 1 to 10, let us know where you're located. I always want to know where the audience is located. Please let us know that. Joun is the principal of Diversity Workplace Consulting Group that specializes in innovative, implementation-focused, no-thrills, diversity and inclusion training and consultation. I met her when she was a vice president of talent, diversity, and inclusion at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. They went on to become one of my sponsors, where she led the enterprise diversity and inclusion talent acquisition, performance management, and leadership development activities at Blue Cross Blue Shield. She's an amazing person. We're going to hear from her in just a few minutes. Daniel StrongWalker Thomas is the keeper of the Fire Chief Servant Leader Global Initiative for Indigenous Advancement. Daniel is of the Lenape people, known as the Delaware Nation, and a descendant of the Oneida people from the Green Bay, Wisconsin area. He is the president of the board of directors and serves as the chief servant leader of the Global Initiatives for Indigenous Advancement. We move on and hear from Michael Welp. And in 1995, Michael partnered with Bill Proudman to co-found White Men as Full Diversity Partners. And for 30 years, has worked extensively with organizations around the world to grow courageous leadership skills, transform conflict, and create cultures of full inclusion. Welcome, Michael. And our last speaker will be Mark Williams. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Identity Post. Mark is a highly regarded thought leader, consultant, public speaker, and the author of 5 books, including his latest book, The Multi-Identity Mindset, I hope I pronounced that correctly, to living and working in a multicultural world. The 10 lenses have been used for Global 500 corporations, community, institutions of higher education, local and federal government, and industry conferences at secondary schools with faculty and students. Mark Williams will be our 4th and final speaker. So I'm going to begin with Joun, and I'm going to first of all take a quick look. You've been very busy in the chat room. Thank you. We appreciate all your answers coming from Atlanta, from North Carolina, from Eugene, Oregon, Baltimore, Maryland, Milwaukee, Cleveland, all over the United States, Dallas, Rhode Island, and obviously here in the greater Boston area. And your numbers are quite interesting. And I would encourage our panelists to look at the numbers and see if you have any commentary. They range from 6 or so to 8. So I'm going to open it up with Joun, and she will bring our opening remarks. Sue, take it away.
Thank you, Carole. Good to be with you all today. It wouldn't be correct if we didn't acknowledge recent events that's happening across our country. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Stop Asian Hate that is happening right now. And as an Asian American, I actually had to personally decide if I'm going to show up, how am I going to show up, and what am I going to say about all this? Because as you are part of the community, you're processing your own experiences and your own emotions. And then as a diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner, you also have to figure out what is the thing that you want to say. And frankly, I struggled with that for the last couple of weeks, and decided that that it would not make sense not to raise the topic. So here are my thoughts about it. The recent events that's in Atlanta is not the start of Asian American discrimination and violence. America has a long history, everything from the Chinese massacre that happened in the late 1800s to the Exclusion Act that excluded anyone who was Chinese or looked Chinese to not be able to enter into this country, to, of course, World War II and the Japanese encampment, where about 180,000 people were put into camps, 62% of which were US citizens, to recently as 1980s, where a Chinese man was attacked thinking that he was Japanese because people were angry that Japanese were taking US jobs. And of course, all the way to now, there's been a huge increase in Asian hate crimes and reporting of harassment. And I think with the Asian community, at least I'll speak for myself, is we're in essence saying, please validate that the discrimination and harassment and violence in the Asian community is real. Please hear us, please acknowledge us. And frankly, I can't believe we have to say it, but remember, we belong here. We are US citizens. And sometimes as immigrants, and sometimes as people in marginalized or minority communities, I often say sometimes it feels like we're foster children. We know we have every right to be here. We know it's legal to be here, but we always wonder, do you really want us here? And are we one thing away from being kicked out? And so what I will say to the Asian community is to know that we belong here. We have every right to be here. We're strong, and keep going and keep speaking. Mainly because the Asian community has been relatively silent and ignored. Silence only happens if there is silence and if the community is actually ignored and not heard. And so I do just want to say that the Asian community, at least for myself, we will no longer be silent and we will no longer be ignored. The Asian community is also faced with a lot of microaggressions. And when I say microaggressions, I mean things like, sometimes people say Asian community is invisible. Here's why. Often we are mistaken for other people who are Asians, as if we're almost interchangeable. We're also, our names are mispronounced and misspelt. And sometimes many of us are given American names, even as early in our elementary school days by our teachers, who says, that's too difficult for me to pronounce. I'm gonna call you Mark from now on. And so when you layer the interchangeability and then you layer the name, and then on top of that, some of us have been ingrained by our parents to be hard workers, to blend in so that no one can deny us opportunities. And when you have all of that pressure on you, those phenomenons, it's sort of erase, and you become invisible. Or assimilate, and you become invisible. Or they call you model minority. Not sure what that means, but really it was given by the majority to describe Asian Americans as model minorities, which then needlessly pits us against other minority groups, one. Number two, it keeps the position in the power of the majority because they get to decide if you're a model or not. And so I will say for all those reasons, I'm hoping that we can continue to spend time and attention on the Asian community way after the headlines are gone. Second thing I want to say is that, however, does not cancel and does not stop acknowledging other pains that are happening in other communities. Rather, it's transgender rights. There's many legislation that's looking to bring transgender rights back, all the way to Black Lives Matter. It still does matter. That pain and that hurt and that violence is still real and ongoing, and I could keep going. And what I want to say about all of that is we are all looking for validation that the pain exists. Your pain does not cancel my pain. And even if your pain is greater, it doesn't mean my pain isn't real. So I'm hoping that all of us as a society has the bandwidth to understand all those different pains, not cancel them out, and actually take the time to validate them. The last thing I will say is let's go beyond the hashtags and the social vocal outrage and actually change laws, change policies, change practices, change norms, all the way from the political spectrum to the social spectrum to our individual workplaces as well. That it can't just be words alone and it can't just be emotional outrage alone, that the work and the practices, everyday norms, to promotions, to hiring, to social policies, to political atmosphere and political representation, action is needed just as much as empathy. Thank you.
Well, you've kicked us off, and I've been listening to you, Sue, and watching the chat. People in the chat are extremely respectful and happy that you've addressed the elephant in the room, dealing with the horrific events that have taken place in the Asian community. And what I'm struck with, and we'll talk about this a little later, erase, 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 and then you become invisible. That's pretty significant. Let's think about that. Keep the comments coming in the chat room. Please use the Q&A box for your questions so that we can address them later on in the program. Now, as a leader in the Indigenous community, we want to bring on Daniel StrongWalker Thomas. Daniel.
Hello, thank you. Just for point of clarification, my name is Daniel StrongWalker Thomas.
Thank you.
Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. I am the hereditary and traditional chief of the Lenni Lenape people. I know that's not on my resume because that's something we share in person or in meetings like this with people, not something we promote as a job. It's interesting to be in this group. As I look around here, I see all of the colors of the medicine wheel coming together. And the colors of the medicine wheel are our Black brothers and sisters, our yellow brothers and sisters, our white yellow brothers and sisters, and our red community members and brothers and sisters as well. So here we are together in a circle discussing issues that matter most to both our communities and to the greater society as a whole. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that I am here in Massachusetts, which is the traditional homelands of the Mashpee Wampanoag people. We also have the Nipmuc community here in Massachusetts, and it is an honor to walk upon their land. The Lenape people have homelands upon New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And those are the homes that my people have been forcefully removed out of. And now my people reside in 5 different communities spread across both the United States and Canada, and with many Berlin walls, if you will, that separate us. Although we're one people, we're separated by vast distances. For instance, my nation is in Anadarko, Oklahoma, whereas we have another Lenape nation in Bartlettsville, Oklahoma, another one in Wisconsin, which you may know as the Stockbridge Munsee, Mohican people. I've just come back from meeting with their president upon unification of our people for the homelands. And then we have 2 communities in Canada and Ontario. Often what I'd like to share with this group of thought provokers and peers and people changing and breaking the mold is that the red community is not spoken of often in these communities discussions, and I have to address that. As we all addressed the elephant in the room, I must say that I'm very grateful for Color Magazine to ensuring that the red people are at this table and a part of the conversation. And I do know that they have invited others in the past. But all too often, we are just one part of the acronym, but not part of the room, part of the conversation. And I will tell you that is because you're fishing in the same ponds, hoping to get different catches or a multitude of catches. If you are interested in working with the Indigenous community, you must reach out to the Indigenous nations within your organization's wheelhouse, whether it's their home offices or wherever service area they're working in. I'll tell you, we have Native Americans make up less than 2% of the population. That's about less than 6.6 million, and we're considered minority in this room. But when we look at our Black brothers and sisters who are roughly about 41 million, which make up, a vast majority of our minority community, and of course our yellow and white brothers and sisters, we need to unify. Just like voices are not amplified. And because we are often, the left out of the conversations, our voices are not brought into the conversations. And we have a unique aspect and a unique view on these matters from a people who weren't even allowed to be citizens until 1924, while the rest of the country, were voting or whatever. We were not allowed to even be citizens until 1924. We were prisoners of war technically today, living on a reserve and being provided supplements for our lands that have been stolen in the form of healthcare and these such, which lack severely. It wasn't until 1978 that we could even practice our religion or our spirituality. It was under the guise of Christianity and other religions, which we have no problem with your religion. We appreciate and love all people's spirituality. But it wasn't until 1924 that we were even safe to conduct our own spirituality. So now here in the modern day, where we see corporations building very strong relationships with their minority groups or doing work through D&I, again, the conversation is not brought in with the Indigenous people. So I'm here to ask and to promote a bridge building between our communities, between you thought leaders, between you leaders in the community. And I would love to provide information on how to get in contact with us and what we can provide in the conversation. So I just wanted to take a moment to address the topic of the first 100 days, and I'll leave it here. We are very happy with a lot that has happened. Indigenous people have been brought to the table by this current administration. And of course, we all know that Auntie Deb Haaland is Interior Secretary, and we're very, very proud of this. We're hoping for more advancements, but let me share our humble speculative opinion is left wing, right wing, same bird. Now, historically, we have not always been treated well by either party, but we remain optimistic. Okay, we remain optimistic, and we remain people who want to be a part of the solution and not just present problems. We want to present solutions for our own communities. So Wanishi, which is the Lenape word for thank you, Wanishi for allowing me to share time and space with you in this circle.
Lots of food for thought. Daniel StrongWalker Thomas, appreciate your comments and want to acknowledge the more than thousands and thousands of years of history of the Indigenous people here on the continent. We figure that there was a land bridge between the Bering Straits in what is now known as Siberia and what we now know as Australia. And as countries and continents were much closer together, that there was a movement, a walking movement that went from one continent to the other. And the Indigenous people, we call them now Indigenous people, came by way of that land bridge, the Bering Straits area. I was also struck by your comment, left wing, right wing, same bird. And also, as I teach with my diversity programs, that here these Indigenous people weren't even made citizens until 1924. I use that in the work that I do. So we'll come back to you with other comments in the minutes to come. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to Michael Welp, who will talk to us about white men. Michael.
Thanks, Carole. Just showing up here and being here, it's important for me to just be present to your message, Sue, and your message, Daniel, and soon your message, Mark. And I'm really resonating with, that your experiences are real, Sue. And that I feel that in my heart, and that I am part of a group that ignores or doesn't see that or contributes to your invisibility and perpetrates hate crimes. And how do I, as a white male and a white person, how do I see that? Do I see it? Do I intervene? Do I contribute to more of the problem? Do I intervene and be part of the solution to help you be visible, to help your experiences be felt, and to actually, what you said is, we belong here. How do I daily contribute to whether you feel you belong here? And Daniel, too, your words to me resonate most, and must reach out. We must reach out, and I contribute. and my people contribute to your invisibility, as well as all the oppression and excitement of one person in a cabinet that represents your people is like a breakthrough. But man, that's just a little piece of the pie. So you're also saying our voices are not amplified. And I just say that lands in my body. It's still sitting here in my heart. So I'm 25 years ago, I've been on my own journey as a white male, growing up in Iowa in the Midwest, not really learning about race, gender issues until I moved to the East Coast and was part of a big graduate program that looked deeply at those issues, and then ended up living in South Africa for a year, working on race there. And after Mandela's release, finding myself not that different than the white guys there. I'm in charge. People conform to my system, and I'm not aware of how they assimilate and the impact of that. So I felt compelled to come back to the US and work with people like me, other white guys. And the dissertation I did, I found, not surprising to all of you here, that most white guys learn everything from people of color and white women, and don't look to each other for any of this. And so we started changing that about 25 years ago when we started putting white guys in a room for 4 days to look in the mirror at ourselves and see, what does it mean to be white and what does it mean to be male, and work on our blind spots to shift the burden from others to educate us, to shift the burden from you all to have to raise the issues all the time. And, so there's some mindsets that we challenge and have to be challenged around us. You can think of the focus on race as often on people of color and never looking at whiteness, rarely. You can look at gender issues, it's always focused on women. We don't have to examine ourselves and men and how we partner with women or how we perpetrate a culture that where you also feel outside as an outsider. So globally, we do a lot of that work where we help insiders see our insiderness. And that includes white women not hiding behind gender in your outsiderness, but seeing your insiderness from a race perspective as well. And your classic experience that I've seen for years from white guys is we actually often perceive the playing field as level, and efforts towards diversity are like giving others an advantage, and we feel the short end of the stick. And that's from an incomplete view of the world, because we're looking through a lens that we think we treat everybody the same. We don't see color, we don't see gender. And the intent of that is equality. The impact is we are perpetuating a simulation where we'll treat you the same as long as you fit into our box. And maybe we'll see you a little bit. Maybe we'll give you a taste of belonging. So the work here is a peer intervention amongst white folks and a peer intervention amongst white men. Can we take on that way of helping each other see our blind spots, see our micro inequities, major inequities, and shift some mindsets too, that somehow we start thinking we're helping other people with their issues. When, as you, Daniel, talked about the circle of all of us in this together, and anytime any of us benefits, we all benefit. And there is so much for white men to gain from diversity. We have the privilege of growing up in a culture where we don't even know we're in the water we swim. We think it's being a good human, and yet we're conforming, many of us, to this box of don't ask for help, go it alone. Asking for help is weak. Oversimplify the world, see things in black and white, disconnect from our heart because it's seen as taken away from our credibility of being rational. Only our value is in our actions and doing and not in being. And so that doesn't emphasize relational intelligence or connections. Those are some of the traits of a culture that we're stuck in like a prison. When we don't have awareness of it as a culture, we think it's what a good human is. And it becomes the lens to which we define who's good, promotable, qualified employees. And you end up having to fit into our box. And, the cost of that, leaving part of yourselves at the door. And we are learning as we unnumb ourselves out to the cost for that. And when we use the strong tenets of our culture and step outside of it, to be more in our hearts, to ask for help, to say, I don't know, to be more in a relational space. Wow, we gain our significant relationships in our lives as white folks and white men gain, and everybody wins. So what's important for white men, and I think the administration's changed. Biden's rescinded the executive order, but all the mechanisms that have made many white folks think that diversity work is un-American, or looking at privilege as somehow un-American. It's like, that's still in place. We've done sessions just a week or two ago where white men were, Mark, you were in one of those, you were facilitating one of those. It's like, they thought we were there to beat them up, tell them they're bad. And that's some of the narrative that's been that's out there. So we have to,
it does. I think
we have to counter that.
The business driver is still going to be a multinational headquartered in the U.S.
Hey, Gwendolyn, I think you need to mute.
Multinational headquartered in Europe, probably European.
Maybe Evans can mute
We're still
Gwendolyn.
Western
I'm not sure if Evans, he
Western
did step
geographic
away, but
Okay. So yeah, we have to step into the notion that it's about helping everybody, and that this work, helping America work across difference, is important for us to help everybody see that all of us win. And it's because some white men have been taught.
Michael, hold up. Just what you're making such great points. Just hold up. Let's see if we can get Gwendolyn's attention. Evans, I'm not sure if you are back, if you can ask Gwendolyn to mute herself, and we'll take care of that, just because I don't want to shortchange Michael with the comments that you're making. Or maybe Camilla, if you could possibly mute her.
Yeah, we're going to go in and try to do that. Thank you.
Okay. Great. She's probably totally unaware that she's unmiked or has a hot mic.
He's a really valuable partner.
So
that's my bias.
I'll pause.
Okay.
Everybody, we're giving everybody a little digestive break.
Yes, and I have pages. I'm almost on page 2 with you, Michael, just because your comments are so relevant, and there's so many ways that we can just follow up with you with the things that we want to make.
He needs to be.
And so Camilla, is Evans around?
Relationships.
Evans, okay, you're here. Evans, you need to mute Gwendolyn.
This is complex,
I see your name, so Gwendolyn needs to be muted.
I'll see. How's
Camilla,
yeah,
Camilla?
I'm trying to get Gwen's attention.
I can do that.
I don't
and
have
I also,
the
I know you sent me a message.
rights to do it, so just bear with us for a minute.
Okay, no problem. These things happen. We're in a Zoom world, so we know these things happen.
Michael, what it feels like to not.
I could not remember. I just remember
I appreciate that, Daniel. It's a good metaphor. That's awesome. Need it now. I'm just noticing.
Okay, you're good. Go
just
for it, Michael.
noticing the tension in my body from that. It's like somehow I'm supposed to overcome any barrier to speak, and I'm like pulled and like listening to that and this and trying to get reconnected to my voice. So Daniel, it's like it's just a little taste of what your world might be like. Sue and Mark, what your worlds might be like. So I take a breath to reconnect. How are we doing with time, Carole? You want to take me another minute or two, or?
Yes, about another 2 minutes and you'll be fine.
Okay. Yeah, so the opportunity for to reframe what some of the narratives in the media have been putting out there, that white men are losing, and there really is a message that's been put in, for instance, when I tune into Fox News, there's like a narrative that says, well, these white professors are teaching white privilege to these students and they're being taught it's all their fault. And that's not how we talk about privilege or at all. It's simply about what do I not have to navigate that others navigate. So looking at the difference side of the world instead of the sameness side of the paradox. and understanding that even like me being able-bodied, I don't have to navigate a wheelchair. Me being white, I don't have to navigate. So I have plenty of challenges. So one of the things that we do need to do for white folks is talk more about class, talk more about some of the where we do feel outsiderness in our lives, so that we feel seen and heard. And everybody, and when they see their outsiderness seen and felt, it is helpful. It's easier for them to start to look at their insiderness. And then how can we use that insider privilege honorably to create space for everybody? So that is, I'll come back, but we need to help white men see with new eyes, know with head and heart, to reach for, as you said, Daniel, reach for new relationships and connections to create solidarity, and then go after experimenting in our organizations with new behaviors to address systemically inequities and call out the barriers, and use our power as insiders to be heard around that and amplify other voices.
You bring up some great points, Michael. First of all, your transition from what we just experienced to getting back on track, we appreciate that. Brought up an awful lot. I'm just struck by the insiderness comment that you made, but just a very powerful quote. We'll see you as the same if you fit into our box. Just we'll have more questions for you. I'm sure that others will. Something that I was really struck with this morning in the Boston Globe, there's a hot and heavy discussion about the Mckenzie Consulting Corporation, a giant company, very, very big. Their power just resonated with me when I saw the numbers. They have to now spend $500 million based on a charging or a discrepancy that took place within their firm and their clients around the country. Yet here in Massachusetts, and they owe money to Massachusetts, about $8 million to Massachusetts alone, the state of Massachusetts still granted them a $13 million contract that they are going to execute. They've been working with our state with COVID issues since last year. And I wonder if a Black firm capable of those same kind of skill sets, I'm going to use Black because I'm Black, could have withstood that same amount of discrepancy, cost allocation going back to various states, and still having been said, we're going to give you a contract anyway for $13 million. That I sort of look to as I digest and understand what Michael is saying in terms of white men in particular. So open question. We're going to move on and continue our conversation with Mark Williams. Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Carole. And thank you to this panel. You've all touched me in the heart. And I'm happy to be here. And I will level with all of you. I think Biden administration is great and is making changes, and the tone is improving. But I have not gotten over the last 4 years. I have not gotten over the big lie in the attempt to disenfranchise voters in multiple states who are people of color. I have not gotten over an insurrection at the Capitol. And like Carole, being a Black person, watching what happened as people walked away, wondering what would have happened if those folks had been people of color. I have not gotten over what happened in Atlanta. I have not gotten over the vote that happened last night in Georgia that for all practical purposes pushes us back to Jim Crow. And I have not gotten over the other 28 states that are trying to do the same thing. My heart is still broken. And where I am now and what I see in the larger society is that multiple identity groups are competing for power. Multiple identity groups are trying to determine who controls the systems, the rules, the practices that govern our institutions and communities, what Sue said. We're trying to determine which identity groups have a voice and will be accepted as legitimate, which identity groups have the power to determine who has privileges, Michael, which values we're going to follow and honor, Daniel, and which traditions are going to shape this society. And that is a political struggle. That is about power. That is about to what extent are you willing to use the power you have, whether you're in an organization, whether you're in an institution, whether you're in a community, or whether you're in a society. The forces that are opposed to diversity and inclusion and equity and social justice, as Michael said, have a media ecosystem. They have a strategy. They know how to use legislation. They know how to use intimidation, and they are scared of losing their place. And I want to sort of draw a metaphor to stop the steal. To me, that was never about the election. The steal was about stealing what was legitimately theirs in their mindset. And it goes back to something Sue said. Are we welcome? Are we invited? Is this our home? Are we legitimate? And after all the things that have happened over the last 5 years, I say, of course, yes. And we're going to have to fight for it. We're going to have to fight for it. And as Daniel says and Sue says, we're going to have to form coalitions. We can't erase, Sue, parts of our own coalition. We can't treat each other who are a part of this coalition as outsiders, Michael. We all have to be insiders in this coalition, or else we won't make change. The other piece of it for me is the forces to conform to the way it used to be, to go back to some fantasized notion of normal. I'm done with that. The notion of reforming, just lifting the hood and tinkering a little bit with it and see if we can do a little window dressing. I'm done with that. I think in order to deal with supremacy and deal with patriarchy and all the oppressive forces, we're talking about transformation. We're talking about new ideas. We're talking about new ways of organizing ourselves as human beings. The answers to the challenges we face may not be within the current systems that we're operating. We may need to start looking at new paradigms. So while I'm heartbroken still, my mind and my spirit is focused on new ideas, new ways of addressing challenges, outside of the box thinking, transformational thinking, and understanding that our stakeholders are complex. In an organization, it's the C-suite sometimes. I'm looking at Georgia, watching Coke and some of the major companies down there do backflips, trying to decide how, on one hand, they're going to honor their diversity and inclusion statements and equity statements, and on the other hand, how are they going to deal with the current power structure that is organized to disenfranchise and marginalize, close to 45% of the state. Companies are in the middle of that. The market is in the middle of that. Education is in the middle of that. All of the stakeholders that are in society have a huge, tremendous influence on how we handle these issues. And what I'd like to see us do is to use our power, use our political power, our individual power, our personal power to be more challenging of the status quo. And that will be hard for internal D&I folks. I understand that. Sometimes you're off in a suite. You don't always report to the CEO. You don't always have connections with the board. But decisions are being made by that company, your companies, that are affecting the lives of millions of people, billions of people all over the world. I think of environmental stuff. Who gets located where to live? Who suffers the toxic, all of that. A bank has to make a loan for that to happen. So every institution in society is a part of this. They're all stakeholders. And I think we need to think more broadly, using raw power, soft power, and we have to think about the politics of of what determines who has a voice and who has legitimacy and who has control. So thank you for this opportunity.
Well, the alarm bells have been sounded, certainly from all of our speakers, ending up with Mark Williams. I'm actually trying to pull up the actual article in the Globe. There's several articles about what I mentioned with the Mckenzie story. It is a true story. As soon as I find it, I will put it in the chat room. I try to be as credible as possible when I make those kind of comments. I just have one or two questions for the panel, and then we do have questions that we want to get to in the Q&A box. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. Panel members, and either the four of you can answer together, you can answer individually. As we look at these 100 days and we look at the 4 years we've been through, and roadblocks put in the way in terms of the executive order that was passed, signed on September 22nd that impacted my business and so many others, and then the executive orders that were passed and signed on January 20th. Let me ask this question. What were your thoughts on January 6th when you witnessed a modern day insurrection that had not happened since the War of 1812? What did that tell us about the era that we're now in? And as we look at the work that Michael is doing in terms of trying to recalibrate the minds and the hearts and the behaviors of white men, what are your thoughts about January 6th in particular? And thank you very much. Julius has put the article in the in the chat room. Thank you. You saved me some time. It is a real story. Back to the question, panel.
Well, I'll speak and then I'll be quiet since I just finished. I felt like what we were watching were parallel victim and marginalization realities that a certain group of white men mostly are angry. It picks up on what I just said. Something's being taken from them, and it was theirs. And they had every right to go there and take it back and dispose of it as they would. And I don't believe those folks are in the conversation or in the dialogues or in this conversation that we're having right now at all. I don't believe they're in it at all. And a part of the work that Michael and I do in the organization is trying to bring these folks into the conversation. I think the challenge for us and what that raised for me, Carole, is how do you have that conversation? I don't have the answer to that. I don't know how you have a conversation with people who fundamentally believe that, and Daniel, if I can borrow this, and if it's inappropriate in any way, please feel free to smack me. People who are acting as though they're the new Indigenous group. It's theirs. And they're not going to let anyone take it away from them. They're the new Indigenous. That's how I felt watching that.
Michael, your thoughts? Let me ask Michael, and then I'll pivot to Daniel and then Sue.
Well, watching the primarily white men as, here's my group out there, destroying property in the Capitol and being proud of it, having Facebook videos made and posting it is a sense of entitlement. Mark and I did a session a couple of days ago with some senior leaders of a high-tech company, and we showed this clip that showed the reactions to the Capitol riots and how it was just allowed everywhere compared to the Black Lives Matter protests earlier this year and massive military force, and the different worlds that we live in those. And Mark asked a powerful question. He said, do you think those that were involved in the Capitol riots, are they insiders or outsiders? Because we were introducing this concept of insiders and outsiders, and a lot of the audience really had to think. It's like, yeah, they're like insiders in the privileged way that they accessed and didn't have much resistance, and yet they're taught and feel like they're outsiders. As you said, Mark, they feel like they're losing something. So and then how do you have the conversation where they actually feel some seen for their outsiderness and become aware of their insiderness and just choose to, partner.
Mhm.
That's a high level first thought.
All right. All right. Thank you, Daniel.
Hey, as I was watching the Capitol unfold, and I'm going to be brutally honest here, and I know all of us have been. And when my people were doing the ghost dance on their own land, practicing their own religion, soldiers showed up with submachine guns and mowed them all down. Women, children, men dancing with religion, not armed, not storming anything, on their own land. Then I come to Wounded Knee in the relatively modern future here, and we see the actions of AIM and the things that they have done. FBI shootouts with them, no problem. They have no problem opening fire on Indigenous people. Yet Aziz, and let me share that pain with my Black brothers and sisters and others. We have our Latinos, and we know the story, and I don't want to leave anyone out, and I'm not intentionally, in our Asian brothers and sisters, who the red community stands with you, by the way. We do not stand by at this violence. We stand in unity with your community. But I look at the nonviolence, and I'm not for advocating that I wish they were shot or that I wish they were harmed. But what I'm saying is it just unfolded and told the world that there is a very uneven justice system here, a very biased justice system here, all the way down to the lack of police presence that were there. When Native Americans or Black Lives Matter come to any rally, their police presence is to the T. They're armed to the T. They are riot suited up, and they're ready to cause damage and violence upon the people who are there to express their voices. And then one of the symbols that I see used a lot is the Native American, is the Indigenous person, as Mark sort of referenced. As we see this, I don't even want to reference him, but we know who I'm talking about, dressed in, I'm glad the media picked it up as Viking regalia and did not continue the narrative of that, the shamanistic. So we were thrown into that with the spirit of freedom and the spirit of all of this, while my people are across this nation living in destitution, many of them in cardboard boxes on reservations, which you find hard to believe, but which is absolutely true. Outhouses and reservations, no running water on reservations. This isn't true for all, but this is definitely true for places in this country. And a lot of this has to do with the built up tensions, and the same thing that I just want to bring this to this other moment, and I'm sorry to go too far, and we'll bring it right back to the insurrection. But to see children in cages, to see Indigenous children in cages left there was so hurtful to so many of us, but was a reminder of what happened to the Indigenous children when we were ripped out of our homes, thrown into schools, cut our hair, made to speak other languages, and raped, murdered, and tortured. That's what happened to our children. And so here we are in 2021, grateful that I am here and that my people endured and that yours did too. And here we are in this wonderful circle to talk about this and to build bridges and coalitions to come together to not allow damage to our communities anymore in the corporate world or the political world. So I'll leave it at this and say that the insurrection was exactly what America has been doing since its inception. Imperialism, colonization, white power has been the enemy since the very beginning. These ships showed up on Turtle Island and is still the enemy today. Wanishi.
There you've heard it, mic drop. And we move on and talk to Sue and her people, her legacy in terms of ethnicity. They weren't made citizens until after World War II. Sue, take it away. We're talking about the insurrection on January 6th.
Thank you. I had some Zoom issues, so I had to drop out and come back in. On one hand, it appalls me that we're still talking about this. On the other hand, I'm glad we're talking about this. And on the other hand, I guess what I'll add to all that, first of all, may I just first express how grateful I am for the conversation we're having today. We don't get to have these type of conversations very often. And I'm just delighted to have all of you at the table to have this conversation. And I don't think there's anything else that I could add that would highlight or enlighten anymore. So I'll just say a yes and to all that's been said, which is I do want to shift to conversation of us coming from a place of power. And RGB, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, has this famous quote. You know, people ask me, when will I stop fighting for women's rights? And she said, when we have 9 female Supreme Court justices. And when people were shocked at that, she said, why are you shocked at that? We had 9 male Supreme Court justices for years. Mm-hmm. So I say this, we often talk about being invited to the table. In fact, Mark and I had a little conversation at a previous meeting. We talk about being invited to the table. We want our seat at the table. You know what I say? I want the table. And if us saying we want the table makes you uncomfortable, I want you to ask yourself why. I also no longer want the privilege of being the first one. I want the privilege of being not the only one. So I really do want to acknowledge all the wrong, amplify each other's voices so we can make sure that we're all heard, rather we're at the table or not, and then get our own table and not ask permission. People always ask me, especially in the diversity inclusion space, how do I know that it's been successful? And I say, well, success is a journey, it's not an end state. But the second thing I say is when we're no longer asking for permission to do this work, when people of difference have the right to being mediocre like everybody else. And I'll end there.
Well, another mic drop. And with that, we are going to pivot to your questions. Again, thank you for your comments that you've been making. We're monitoring everything in the chat room. And yes, I'm glad we've had 90 minutes so that we can entertain as many of your questions as possible. First one from Zuri, and the question is, what policy proposals are the panelists most interested in seeing enacted? Let me ask Mark that question first. And we're not going to totally go around. Let me just selectively ask some of our panelists so that we can get to all the questions. So Mark?
I think the foundation of progress for us now in this field of diversity and inclusion and equity is the Voting Rights Act. I'd like to see that policy implemented. Without that, it's going to be tough. We've got to get that done. Mm-hmm. Cannot be an inclusive society if you can't vote.
Daniel?
Standing in the way of anyone's vote is just not appropriate. We have a saying in Indian country, voting is sacred. We treat it as such. We treat it as a sacred event when the people's voice is heard. This idea of building in a pyramid where the power is focused on the top and not in a circle where we all look each other in the eye and deal with the issue is plaguing us. And this is what we're seeing. So my community stands firmly against what's happening with these voters, people getting in the way of voting, suppression, discrimination, firmly against it. And I, for one, say we need to come in numbers and let the people know how we feel about this. But I'll say that for another day.
Yeah. You know, you look at, thank you for your comments. You look at what happened. A lot of what we're talking about now and the progress that's now being made in part had to do with the people who took off from work, who went to the polls to vote, particularly in Georgia, where they had to come for a second special election. And people like Stacey Abrams, who was 3 years ahead of my daughter at Spelman College. My daughter knew her as a freshman and she was a senior in college. And other Black women in particular in Georgia who were heading these incredible grassroots organizations who don't get the money that Mckenzie gets, but yet they're doing the work anyway. And they put 2 men in the Senate, one Black preacher and one Jewish man in the Senate, so that there would be more power in the Senate to get these kinds of legislations passed by. That's voting. That's somebody taking off from work and going and get the job done. And now more than ever, my thought is now more than ever that these more stringent voter suppression laws are in place in Georgia, that ought to make people mad as hell to go to the poll again and 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 vote regardless of what restrictions are put in place. And I'm sure that's going to be ammunition. Let's move on because I'll get going. And this question I'm going to throw to Sue, and it's how do my people contribute? As an Asian American, I also struggle with how best to support other groups. How should I interact as an insider outsider? Sue?
You know, sometimes Asians are called the honorary white, which itself is a very odd term. And because in some ways we're seen as being on the inside and don't have it as bad, right? And on the other hand, we don't belong and we only need you when we need you kind of sentiment. So Asians are in this very interesting place. You know, one of my colleagues said we're sort of on no man's land. So I do understand the question. So I would say as an Asian American, at least for myself, the recent events that happened in Atlanta, for example, vividly brought to my psyche what it feels like to have someone who looks like you, who could be you, who could be a member of your family, die in other people's hands. And that caused me not only to be more upset for my own community and take up that cause even harder, but also made me be even firmly in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And what I'm saying is, as we empathize with what's happening to ourselves, that should make us even greater empathy for the other people that we're next to. And so I say, reach out, understand more, listen to understand, not to debate. Hear what it is that they're saying so that you could amplify them. And definition of an ally isn't just mean that you're in a position of power. Definition of an ally is that you will firmly and steadily stand next to someone so they have critical mass. Rather, that's figuratively, emotionally, or vocally, or literally. Because the number one way, and I'll be honest, change does not happen unless the majority allows it to happen. And the only way change will happen is if there's critical mass. And I'm going to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion in organizations for a moment. We often ask the oppressed to verify that there's oppression and then to fix the oppression using a system that's not equitable.
What she said. Say that again, Sue.
So if you think that's the way it's in organizations, that's the way it's in society, and that's the way it's in politics. By the time you're leaving everything to the oppressed to prove that they're oppressed, fix the oppression using a system that's not equitable. So what I'm saying is leaders of organizations, corporations, societal, politic leaders, if change is not happening, it's because you're not moving the majority to make it happen. Because you know who could influence the majority? The people who are in positions of power. So if you have any ounce of power, or if you have no power, stand next to, figuratively, in a rally, stand next to by donating, stand next to, meaning in a meeting, if someone says something, at least acknowledge that it has been said. If you are in positions of power, use your power to move the majority towards the place that it needs to go. And as an Asian American, I say, don't be a model citizen anymore. Cause a ruckus. Demand that you belong here with equal rights. Amplify each other for those generations of Asian Americans who literally couldn't say anything. And amplify other people's and other communities and other causes. We have the bandwidth to lift all rights.
All right, as she has so eloquently said, and John Lewis said, causing good trouble. That's what we're talking about. Yes, great. This question is from Michael. I'm going to try to combine two questions, one that was in the chat room and one that was directed here in the Q&A box. It says, Michael, how can we get white male leadership to buy into DEI initiatives? There's often a pushback to accept and celebrate the differences in our corporations. If they give an example, let me team that up with another question that was in the chat room. Let me go back to this question. How in the world do you try to have a conversation with January 6th rioters? How do we have a conversation with those people at our workplace? And yeah, they do work with you. That is so true. They're here in whatever state, city you're in. So Michael, just a combination of those two questions.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. Those are both, I like to talk to white guys that your worldview isn't wrong, it's incomplete, more likely. So this is not about you being wrong. This is not about you being bad, but what are you not seeing? And, again, back to that sameness difference paradox, we're more comfortable looking at the sameness part of the world, and we're not understanding what's happening around what others are dealing with that we don't have to deal with. And there's a lot of aspects of our, what I call white male culture, that don't help us see this stuff. We're looking through an individual lens all the time, the rugged individualist. We're not sensitive to the group dynamics, the insider outsider dynamics. We have to learn to see that. We look at this through a head level and try to get it cognitively. We're really going to get it. As one CEO said to me, I had an empathy gap. I had a missing empathy gap around the experiences of other colleagues that I work with, which is what, Sue, you're talking about. A voice, amplify the voice, help us be seen, feel our experience. And then we don't like to, make mistakes. So a lot of white guys will sit back and not be part of the conversation and play it safe to avoid the landmines, of which there's plenty, but no learning happens. And so how do we put ourselves at risk? How do we challenge ourselves and our peers? So I say, one sign of a cultural shift in organization is you see white men challenging other white men and doing it from a place of putting their relationships at risk with each other, willing to call each other out in front of others, and see that as a way to have each other's backs and expect that we give ourselves permission to be confused, lost, and in the turbulence. And I have to manage anxiety whenever I'm living, because even on this webinar, I could say something stupid in the next, 3 minutes that's going to embarrass me, that even if I've done this work for 25 years, and I got to live with that humility, I got to live with the ability to be courageous and be vulnerable, see vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness, like I've been taught growing up. And actually that allows me to connect more. I got to get out of the doing fix it mode, and I can't fix what I don't understand. So I got to be with the messiness and sit with it and slow down and relate, and just learn to be more comfortable being uncomfortable. And man, that's going to help me in my personal life just as much as my work life, by the way. So when I go in an organization, I always say, do you have white male sponsors yet? Do you have white men or white folks? Or often the D&I lead is a person of color or a white woman. And if they are, having to carry this themselves, and then the white guys get anxious about having a focus on them, so grow some sponsors early on, and ideally have them have a deep experience. I mean, get the joy of working with folks for 2-4 days, and they get into their heart, they get vulnerable, they see and feel this at such a deep level. It's a risk sometimes to try to cover the depth of concepts like privilege and dominant culture in like 3-hour session. It's less risky to actually push for a few people to have a deep learning experience over days, and then let them come back and speak to their peers and tell them why they need to take this deep journey of learning to be able to see what they haven't seen before and connect in ways they haven't connected before. So that's a little bit of the answer, I think, is white guys need to risk. And the sameness paradigm, there's a question about ERGs, what helps white men tolerate, it's an interesting word, ERGs, actually see the value. And it's like, if I look through the sameness lens, I'm going to say, well, ERG groups are just divisive. Diversity focus is divisive. Why don't we just focus on inclusion? And I need to understand that to get to inclusion, I need to see difference. I need to see the different experiences. So I need to have that lens. And employee resource groups help retention. Most research shows that they help 23-25% more retention of people of color, women, other groups. And that's an important fact too, that, you know, it might be divisive to even look and be in a group of white men talking about your white maleness. That might feel divisive, but, you know, there's a short-term pain perhaps or discomfort, and there's a long-term gain to look at what we need to do, our work with each other in order to partner better.
Well, there you have that answer, which can certainly have part 2, 3, and 4 to it. But thank you, Michael, for answering it. I'm going to ask for 2 lightning rounds. I have 2 final questions, one to ask Mark and then one to ask Daniel before we switch it back to Camilla and Evan. And Mark, your question is, as the D&I team, how do we approach getting the buy-in of the demographic majority, white males, at most questions? Mark Williams, what are your thoughts?
I think by being real, piggybacking on something Michael said, making it okay to not be, well, let me just put it this way, making it okay to start where you're starting. Talking about D&I is not as if it is the only mindset or the only approach to dealing with differences. There's a whole other approach out there. You talked about some of it, Carole. And if they can't come in the room and be honest about how they're starting the conversation, if they're expected to leap over an ideological and mindset and belief system bridge in order to participate, they'll shut down, they'll be silent, and they'll comply, and they'll leave that room, they'll leave that space, they'll leave that initiative and do basically nothing. I don't believe we have opened up the door to have the conversation with white men that starts where they are. I think we've got to start where they are. Hear where they're coming from. And sometimes it's in a totally different reality.
That interestingly goes back to what Michael had said earlier about we'll let you in sort of our club, our world, sort of if you fit into the mental block that we're operating under. And that's an interesting perspective that I'm sure Color Magazine will deal with the next 100 days with their next session. I want to switch this question. Thank you very much, Mark, for that. Daniel, the question we have for you is, we often say, let's not be political when we have DEI conversations. How is that possible?
They're not. It's not possible. This is a political, for instance, being Native American is a political designation. We're the only race who has to prove who we are, have to enroll. We have to go through a whole process of presenting our family lineage and documents to our tribal nation, who then has to present that information to someone else in the government, and then we get permission to be Native American. So when you talk about politics in the D&I world and keeping it out, it's just impossible if you want all people at the table. I would like to touch another thing though on women, white women. I'm calling out to you to be allies. These white men are running around doing the things that they're doing and coming home to you and other partners, okay? And historically, white women, you haven't been great allies to the people of the minority community, all right? And I say that with love and respect for those who have been. And what I'm asking you now is to stand up in solidarity with us and learn more, engage yourself more, communicate more. These conversations are happening at home with your children and with your family. And this is not the responsibility of any one person, it's the family, but white women and women in general. Let me speak for my community. Women in general are the center point. We're a matriarchal society. We get our clans and everything from our females, and they run everything. You may hear of chiefs or whatever, but they get to speak to the elder women who tell them ultimately what is and is not okay. So the power lies in the women. And, very quickly, you know how you hunt a wolf? You don't. What you do is you put a knife into the wood, into the ground, put blood on the knife, and the wolf will come and it will start licking the knife itself until it passes away, thinking it found food. okay? And then what happens is they blame the wolf and not the hunter for that. And that's often what happens, is that we're thinking we're getting resources and we're getting involved in these conversations and we're doing work, but we're really destructing our own community. So be very careful about what you believe you find that helps your community when it may not be helpful. And so we're searching for allies, and I hope we've made some today.
What a metaphor. My. Wow. Watch what you lick. Wow. Thank you very much, Daniel. There's another question I'm going to very quickly just throw out to anybody. I want to pull this in. And yes, I believe that the recordings are going to be available. That was another question. Camilla will answer that question along with Evans very shortly. This last question is, how does an organization try to steer, or does it, conversations or discussions within its community on social media to remain productive and civil, to get past accusations, swearing, sarcasm, defensiveness, and into real discussion that builds unity? Our community is tearing each other apart from both sides. I want to take a stab at that at first and then throw it out to maybe a couple of you, one or two of you, as we round out this great conversation. I have for many years been on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and now Instagram as well. And particularly on Facebook, and now increasingly on LinkedIn, I have open discussions with people on both sides. I will throw a question out there looking for a debate, a respectful debate. And with very few occasions, the debates are pretty spirited. The conversations are very spirited. So there are ways where your organizations and where you can position questions and position information, maybe put a picture with the question that you have, and openly ask your audience to give their feedback and give their comments about it. It can be done. Now, there are a couple of occasions where the answers from my point of view are so absurd, I delete them. So you, the author, you, the owner of that particular site, you do have a right to delete responses that are made that are just off track or just absurd. But for some people, as we've now heard, where that's their real true feeling and opinions, it can be done intellectually from a very credible perspective if you allow people to agree to disagree with the various posts that you put in place. Anybody else want to jump in there and answer that question?
If I may, for just 1 second, very briefly, the partnership, which I'm very lucky to have been a graduate of, and thank you to them, I learned something very important there. Are you trying to prove something or improve something? And that right there is the beginning. If you're trying to prove something, argument and debate is just going to happen. But if you're trying to improve something, then there you go. And very quickly, again, if you compare what's going on in this country to a adolescent a bit, as the countries go, we're a fairly young country, right? We're a country whose father and mother did not get along so well, and we broke up, and we actually emancipated ourselves from the parents. And then we were silent, and we kept hold, and everything was known. This racism and everything was known. It was silent, and you knew the lines, and it was shown in violence. And now people are screaming and yelling and acting out. To me, I welcome it. I welcome it because it is a sign that things are being able to change. You cannot change things you cannot discuss. So you cannot control the wilds and the crazy comments that happen out there, but the conversation is the most important part. An artist is only creative, not because they create a beautiful thing of art, but because they put it out there for other people to comment on. And it's in that social commentary that the social value of that art is seen. So these conversations in Facebook can often be seen that way, as they play a social value. And just remember to always leave it on a point of unity. What I like to say is, we may disagree greatly on these issues, but I'm sure we agree on others. Have a good day.
Daniel, StrongWalker, Thomas, thank you very much. Sujan, your comments as we close?
I just want to echo what Daniel said. All voices welcome doesn't mean only the voices we like. You have to deal with the consequences of all voices heard. And all voices heard doesn't mean we agree, we just mean all voices will be heard. Every time there's an article, sometimes the comments that's underneath that article is very difficult to read and process, but you need to know that it exists You need to know that those thoughts and comments exist. I believe those of us who were surprised with elections, previous elections, were shocked because we didn't pay enough attention to the comments, because those thoughts existed and has always been there. So what I say is we welcome all voices. We welcome white men, white women, other marginalized groups into the table. We want to hear what is going on, and we want partners to move things forward. So I say inclusion is not pretty, it's not harmonious, it's not always something agreeable, but inclusion means we got to hear it all.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. Michael Welp.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm still impacted by both of your suggestions. And I think that polarization happens because there's not enough space for people to tell full stories, more complex stories of who they are. And Facebook, social media just reinforces polarized, short views and narratives of each other. And, you know, the more we can hear each other, some of the research about political differences is get people into conversations and say, what's at the heart of your political beliefs? What life experiences have you had that created those beliefs? And is there anything the other side has that resonates for you more? Just break down those simple narratives that the other side is bad or the other side is doesn't care, and understand the depth of, you know, if we can hear each other's stories or hear each other's realities and the complexities, we humanize each other rather than dehumanize each other. And we've got to model the world we want to create in the process of coming together. We can't just beat each other up somehow and then assume that the world's going to flow with love. You know, we got to model the love and choose that over fear in the way we interact with each other.
Michael, thank you very much for those comments. Great food for thought. Before we get to Mark Williams making the last thought, since I think most of us are here in the United States, number one, first of all, the chat is savable. So if you're on a particular device, a laptop or a desktop, you can save the chat. There are a couple of links there that you may want to pay attention to, and obviously the comments. So before you leave today, save the chat, and then you'll be able to respond accordingly. And also, yes, this is being recorded, but Camilla will give us more information about that. But most importantly, we Americans still are in a leading position in terms of helping the rest of the world to get to their place of DEI work. I'm actually having a UK-US conversation on race on May 22nd. I'll get the information to Camilla and she can get it out to you, working directly with my contacts in the UK on this, because we know how significant and how important this conversation is to the rest of the world. So don't think that you don't make any difference. You do make a difference. Your comments make a big difference, and literally can be replicated to many, many people elsewhere. Just look at what happened immediately following the death of George Floyd and the eruptions that took place all over the world. So we're having a domestic US conversation that will have worldwide implications. Mark Williams, close us up. Oh, you're on mute.
We have to become more educated consumers of information on the web. There are bad actors, and the Senate Intelligence Committee in their investigation of the interference from the last election said that the overwhelming majority of disinformation was directed at communities of color. So that's something to keep in mind, that the platform can be used for good, and the platform can also be harmful if we don't pay attention. And I'm going back to what Sue said. We have to pay attention, and emphasizing what Michael said. Try to stay within conversations that are coming from the heart.
Right. Stay woke, as they say. That's the the urban conversation and comments too. Mark Williams, Michael Welp, Daniel, StrongWalker Thomas, and Sujan, thank you all so much for your fantastic, real, credible insights that you shared with each one of us regarding the first 100 days. It's been a pleasure to be your moderator, and we'll turn it back to Camilla Avant.
Thank you, Carole.
Thank you, Mark, and all. Thank you.
Wow. Awesome to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, what a discussion. Thank you to our panelists and all of you who joined us today. I hope this conversation continues in your homes, in your workplaces, amongst your colleagues and friends. The only way we can move forward is to continue having these conversations. And they're tough ones. And these are experts here. Color will be happy to share their contact information as well. The recording will be made available to all who registered probably by Tuesday. So keep an eye out for our thank you for joining us email that you will get as a follow-up. So thank you again to Mark Williams, Michael Welp, Daniel StrongWalker Thomas, Carole Copeland Thomas, and Joun. Really appreciate you being here with us today, and continue to follow WMFDP and WFD, our partners, and continue to follow Color Magazine. And we're sharing all of our social media handles there as well. And we wish you a safe and healthy weekend as we continue to navigate this pandemic as well. So take good care, and please continue to keep the conversations going.